May 8, 1942. The Coral Sea. The war for the Pacific was 5 months old, and it was going badly. The Imperial Japanese Navy was unstoppable. They had taken Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore. Now they were threatening Australia. In the warm tropical waters of the Coral Sea, the first carrier versus carrier battle in history was raging. It was a blind fight, fought by aircraft over hundreds of miles of ocean. In the center of the American formation was the USS Yorktown, CV-5. She was a beautiful ship, the lead vessel of her class, fast, heavily armed, and beloved by her crew. But on this morning, her luck seemed to have run out. The Japanese dive bombers, the Aichi D-3A Vals, found her. They tipped over from 15,000 feet and screamed down. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. But one pilot, skillful and lucky, released his payload at the perfect moment. An 800-pound armor-piercing bomb slammed into the Yorktown's flight deck. It didn't explode on impact. It was designed to delay. It punched through the teak wood of the flight deck, smashed through the steel of the hangar deck below, drilled through the second deck, and finally detonated deep in the bowels of the ship, 4 decks down. The explosion was contained inside the armored box of the hull. The shockwave had nowhere to go. It buckled the steel bulkheads. It blew out the fires in the boilers. It killed 37 men instantly and turned the lower compartments into a twisted hell of fire and smoke. Up on the surface, the Japanese pilots looked back. They saw a massive column of smoke rising from the American carrier. They saw her slow down. They radioed back to their commanders. Enemy carrier heavily damaged. Sinking. Based on this report, the Japanese High Command made a calculation that would cost them the war. They assumed the Yorktown was dead. They crossed her off the list. But the Yorktown was not dead. She was just hurt. Her damage control party's men, trained to run toward explosions, while everyone else runs away, performed miracles. They shored up the bulkheads with timber. They patched the holes. They got the boilers relit. Limping, trailing a miles-long slick of oil, the Yorktown began the long, painful journey back to Pearl Harbor. She was a cripple. Her radar was glitching. Her watertight integrity was compromised. Her refrigeration units had failed, meaning the crew was eating Spam and rotten vegetables. She had to travel 3,000 miles to get home. May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. When the Yorktown finally dragged herself into the channel at Pearl Harbor, the sight was sobering. The last time she had been here, she was a pristine instrument of war. Now, she looked like a prize fighter who had gone 15 rounds with a sledgehammer. She docked at Dry Dock Number 1. Waiting on the pier was Admiral Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was a calm man with ice-blue eyes, but internally, he was under crushing pressure. American codebreakers had achieved the impossible. They had deciphered the Japanese naval code, JN-25. They knew that Admiral Yamamoto was bringing his entire fleet, 4 heavy carriers, battleships, and invasion forces, to attack the tiny island of Midway. The attack was scheduled for early June, just days away. Nimitz did the math. The U.S. Navy had 2 operational carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. The Japanese had 4, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 2 against 4. It was a suicide mission. Nimitz needed a 3rd deck. He needed the Yorktown. He boarded the damaged ship immediately. He went down into the hull. He walked through the blackened corridors, where the smell of burnt paint and death still hung in the air. He saw the buckled frames. He saw the temporary wooden beams holding up the steel decks. He turned to the repair officer. How long to return this ship to combat status? The repair officer looked at his clipboard. He had already done the estimates. A normal repair for damage this extensive structural beam replacement, hull plating, rewiring, would take 3 months. Maybe more. 3 months, Admiral, he said. Nimitz looked at him. He didn't blink. He didn't shout. He simply said, "We must have this ship back in 3 days." The repair officer stared at him. 3 days was physically impossible. "It takes 3 days just to rig the scaffolding." Nimitz continued, "I want her out of this dock in 72 hours. You can ignore the safety regulations. You can ignore the budget. You can turn off the blackout restrictions. But get her floating." What followed was the greatest industrial sprint in naval history. Dry dock number 1 became a madhouse. 1,400 dockyard workers swarmed the ship. They didn't work in shifts. They worked until they collapsed, and then someone else picked up their welding torch. The distinct blue-white light of arc welders lit up the Hawaiian night. The sound of jackhammers and sledgehammers was deafening, a continuous roar that echoed across the harbor. They didn't fix the Yorktown in the traditional sense. They patched her. The huge hole in the flight deck? They didn't replace the steel plates properly. They welded a giant metal patch over it and hammered it flat. The buckled bulkheads that compromised the ship's structural strength? They didn't cut them out and replace them. They welded massive steel, I-beams directly over the bent metal to brace it. It was ugly, but it was strong. The watertight doors that were twisted off their hinges? They sledgehammered them back into shape until they closed. The entire dry dock was consumed by heat and smoke. The air inside the ship was unbreathable, filled with welding fumes. The workers wore masks and kept going. Admiral Nimitz checked the progress constantly. He knew the stakes. If the Yorktown didn't sail, the Enterprise and Hornet would be overwhelmed. The Japanese would take Midway. Hawaii would be threatened. The war could be lost in an afternoon. On the morning of May 29th, the water began to flood back into dry dock number 1. It had been roughly 48 hours. The Yorktown floated. She wasn't pretty. She was scarred. She still smelled of fire, but her elevators worked. Her flight deck was flat, and her engines could make 27 knots. As she moved slowly out of the harbor toward the open sea, a strange sight greeted the observers. The ship was leaving, but the work hadn't stopped. Hundreds of workmen from the Pearl Harbor shipyard were still on board. They were still welding, hammering, and wiring as the ship sailed to war. They would work until the very last minute, then jump onto tugboats to be taken back to shore. Some didn't make it off in time and ended up sailing into the greatest battle of the war, armed with nothing but wrenches. The Yorktown raced north to a patch of ocean coordinates nicknamed Point Luck. There, she met her sisters, Enterprise and Hornet. Now the math had changed. It was no longer 4 against 2. It was 4 against 3. The odds were still bad, but they weren't impossible. Crucially, the Japanese did not know she was there. Admiral Nagamo, commanding the Japanese fleet, was certain the Yorktown was at the bottom of the Coral Sea. His spy planes at Pearl Harbor hadn't seen her because she had come and gone so fast. He was sailing into a trap. He thought he was fighting 2 carriers. He was about to fight a ghost. On board the Yorktown, the air wing was a patchwork collection. Her original planes had been decimated at Coral Sea, so she borrowed squadrons. She took Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, from the USS Saratoga. The pilots landed on her deck, looked around at the battered ship, and realized they were riding a vessel that refused to die. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading the dive bombers, and Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, the inventor of the Thatch-Weave dogfighting tactic. These were the aces, and they were flying off a zombie ship. June 4th, 1942. Dawn. The sun rose over the Pacific. The weather was clear. Visibility was excellent. Scout planes launched. The game of hide-and-seek began. At 6:03 a.m., APBY Catalina flying boat spotted the Japanese fleet. The radio message crackled through the speakers in the Yorktown's ready room. Many planes heading Midway. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard the Yorktown, was the overall tactical commander. He made the critical decision. He ordered the Enterprise and Hornet to launch everything they had. He held the Yorktown in reserve for a moment, waiting to be sure of the target. Then, at 8:38 a.m., he unleashed the Ghost. Launch everything. The Yorktown turned into the wind. Her deck pitched in the swell. One by one, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers, the F-4F Wildcat fighters, and the slow, doomed TBD Devastator torpedo bombers roared down the patched-up flight deck. They climbed into the blue sky. They were heading for the Japanese fleet. They were heading to deliver a message from the grave. The Japanese thought they had won the war. They were about to find out that the ship they killed was coming to kill them. June 4th, 1942, 10 a.m. The Pacific Ocean. If you had frozen time at 10 o'clock in the morning on June 4th, the Empire of Japan was winning the Second World War. Below the clouds, the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, was a portrait of disciplined violence. 4 magnificent aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were cutting through the blue water in a perfect box formation. They were the masters of the Pacific. They had not lost a single fleet battle since the war began. Their flight decks were hives of frantic activity. Mechanics and armorers were rushing back and forth, refueling and rearming dozens of aircraft for a second strike against the American fleet. The decks were cluttered with fuel hoses, bombs, and torpedoes. It was a chaotic, dangerous environment, effectively a floating powder keg waiting for a spark. But the Japanese commanders felt safe. High above them, the legendary Zero fighters were flying combat air patrol. The Zero was the best dogfighter in the world, fast, agile, and deadly. For the last hour, these Zeros had been butchering the Americans. The first waves of American attacks had been a disaster. The torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet and USS Enterprise slow, lumbering TBD Devastators had arrived without fighter escort. They had flown in low and slow, straight into the guns of the Japanese fleet. It was a slaughter. Of the 15 planes from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, all 15 were shot down. Only one man survived, floating in the water, watching his friends die. The Enterprise squadron fared little better. They had scored 0 hits. The Japanese gunners cheered. They felt invincible. They were shooting down the Americans as easily as swatting flies. The Zero pilots were landing, grinning, giving thumbs-up signs, and taking off again to hunt more. But amidst this carnage, a third group of torpedo bombers arrived. This was Torpedo Squadron 3 VT3. They were flying from the USS Yorktown. The Japanese lookouts were confused. Their intelligence reports said the Yorktown was at the bottom of the Coral Sea, yet here were planes bearing her markings, flown by men who had launched from her deck just hours ago. VT-3 fared no better than the others. They were bounced by the Zeros. They were shredded by anti-aircraft fire. They dropped their torpedoes in desperation and crashed into the sea. But in their dying, they accomplished something crucial. They acted as a magnet. To kill the Yorktown's torpedo bombers, the Japanese Zero fighters had to dive down to sea level. They were swarming right above the waves, their eyes fixed on the water, their guns hot. They had abandoned the high altitude. They had left the roof of the sky open. And at that exact moment, the ghost ship played her second card. High above the slaughter, at 20,000 feet, the sky was silent. The clouds were broken, offering glimpses of the blue sea below. Through these gaps, 2 formations of American dive bombers arrived simultaneously. It was an accident of history. They had launched from different carriers, flown different routes, and arrived at the exact same second by pure chance. From the southwest came the bombers of the Enterprise, led by Wade McGillespie. From the east came the bombers of the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. Max Leslie was flying a SBD Dauntless dive bomber. He was a cool professional, but he was flying with a handicap. Earlier that morning, due to a faulty electrical switch, he had accidentally dropped his 1,000-pound bomb into the ocean. He was flying into battle unarmed. He could have turned back. He could have aborted. But Leslie was leading Bombing Squadron 3v3. He knew his men needed a leader. He decided to dive with them, to strafe the enemy decks with his machine guns, to draw fire, to act as a decoy. Leslie looked down. Through a hole in the clouds, he saw the Japanese fleet. It looked like a model set in a bathtub. The wakes of the ships were white scars on the blue water. He saw the tiny black specks of the Zeros buzzing near the water, miles below. He checked the sky around him. No Zeros. The door was wide open. Leslie tapped his head signal. He opened his dive brakes. The perforated steel flaps on the trailing edge of his wings split open. The plane shuddered, slowing down, poised on the edge of the precipice. He tipped the nose over. The SBD Dauntless drops at a 70-degree angle. It is like riding a roller coaster without rails. The ocean rushes up to meet you. The engine screams as the prop pitch changes. The altimeter unwinds like a clock in a time lapse. 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet. Leslie aimed his formation at the Japanese carrier Soryu. The Soryu was a fast, modern carrier. At this specific moment, she was in the most vulnerable condition a warship can possibly be in. Her flight deck was packed with attack planes. They were fueled up. Their engines were warming up. Piles of bombs and torpedoes were stacked next to them, ready to be loaded. The Japanese lookouts screamed a warning, but it was too late. The sound of the diving American planes was drowned out by the roar of their own engines. At 10:24 a.m., the Yorktown's vengeance arrived. The first bomb missed, splashing into the water just off the starboard bow. A second bomb missed. Then the third bomb, dropped by Lieutenant J.G. Paul Holmberg, hit the flight deck dead center, just forward of the forward elevator. It smashed through the wood and detonated in the hangar deck below. The explosion was apocalyptic. The bomb set off the stacked torpedoes. The torpedoes set off the fuel tanks of the parked aircraft. A chain reaction of destruction ripped through the Soryu. The elevator was blown out of its well and thrown against the ship's island bridge. The flight deck peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. In seconds, the Soryu was transformed from a warship into a floating furnace. At the exact same moment, a few miles away, the Enterprise bombers were doing the same work. They smashed the flagship Akagi. They pulverized the Kaga. 10:25 a.m. 5 minutes. That was all it took. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese Navy was the dominant power in the Pacific. At 10:25 a.m., 3 of their 4 aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, doomed to sink. The fatal 5 minutes had turned the tide of the entire war. And a third of that destruction had come from the planes of the Yorktown, the ship the Japanese thought was already dead. On the bridge of the Yorktown, miles away, Admiral Fletcher and Captain Buckmaster waited. They couldn't see the battle, but they could hear the radio chatter. They heard the whoops of excitement. They heard the calls of target hit. Look at that burner. They knew they had struck a blow, but the battle wasn't over. The Japanese had 4 carriers. 3 were burning, but 1 was still untouched. The Hiryu. The Hiryu was commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, perhaps the most aggressive officer in the Japanese Navy. He watched the smoke rising from his sister ships. He saw the Akagi circling aimlessly, the Kaga and Inferno. He didn't panic. He realized he was the last samurai left standing. He had 1 flight deck. He had a handful of planes. and he knew roughly where the Americans were. He ordered a counterstrike immediately. Launch the dive bombers. Find the American carriers. Sink them. The Japanese pilots were professionals. They had just watched their home ships burn. They were filled with a cold, desperate rage. They took off from the Hiryu and headed east, following the returning American planes like hunters tracking a wounded animal. Their target wasn't random. They were following the planes of Bombing Squadron 3. They were following Max Naley's men home. They were following them back to the Yorktown. 11:50 a.m. Aboard the USS Yorktown. The radar operators on the Yorktown saw them coming. Bogies. Range 30 miles. Closing fast. The ship went to general quarters. The klaxon wailed, a sound the crew knew too well. They had heard it at Coral Sea. They knew what was coming. Captain Buckmaster ordered the fuel lines drained. He ordered the carbon dioxide system charged. He ordered the damage control parties to stand by. This crew was experienced. They didn't run. They grabbed their helmets and flash hoods. The Yorktown also had a combat air patrol. Her Wildcat fighters pounced on the incoming Japanese bombers. They shot down 10 of them. They broke up the formation. But 7 Japanese Val dive bombers broke through. They came down out of the sun, screaming. The Yorktown put up a wall of steel. Her anti-aircraft guns, the 1.1-inch Chicago pianos, the 20mm Oerlikons, the 5-inch heavy guns fired until the barrels were red hot. They blew 3 of the bombers out of the sky before they could release. But 4 got through. The first bomb, it missed the ship but exploded in the water, so close that shrapnel ripped through the hull, killing gunners on the catwalks. The second bomb, it tumbled through the air and smashed into the flight deck. It blew a hole 10 feet wide, extinguishing the boilers in the uptakes. Black smoke poured out of the funnel. The third bomb, this was the killer. It pierced the flight deck, drilled through the hangar, and exploded in the smokestack uptake, the intricate system of pipes that vented the exhaust from the boilers. The explosion blew out the fires in the boilers again. It ruptured the steam lines. The Yorktown lost power. The screws stopped turning. The hum of the ventilation fans died. The ship coasted to a halt, dead in the water. Silence fell over the vessel. The only sound was the crackle of fires and the shouting of damage control teams. High above, the surviving Japanese pilots looked down. They saw a carrier burning, stopped, and listing. They radioed back to the Hiryu. American carrier heavily damaged, burning, sinking. It was the exact same report they had made at Coral Sea a month earlier. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiryu was pleased. He believed he had leveled the score. He thought he had sunk the Enterprise or the Hornet. He didn't know he had just attacked the Yorktown ... again. But the Yorktown had a secret weapon, her crew. For the second time in a month, the damage control parties performed the impossible. They dove into the smoke-filled compartments. They patched the steam lines. They relit the boilers, standing in oil and water, choking on fumes. Up on the bridge, Captain Buckmaster watched the pressure gauges. Engine room reports steam pressure building. The flags went up. My speed 5, then my speed 10, then my speed 15. Incredibly, less than an hour after being bombed, the Yorktown was moving again. The fires were out. The flight deck was patched with plywood. She was ready to launch planes. She raised a new huge American flag on the mast, a gesture of defiance to the world. She was the zombie ship. You could bomb her, burn her, and break her, but she just kept coming back. But the Japanese were not done. Admiral Yamaguchi still had planes. He had his torpedo bombers, the Nakajima B-5 Enkates, the elite of the fleet. At 14:30, the radar picked them up again. Bogies, low on the water. Torpedo planes. The Japanese pilots approached the American fleet. They saw a carrier moving at 20 knots, flying a large flag with no smoke. They assumed it was a different carrier. They assumed the one they had bombed earlier was sinking miles away. They attacked. The Yorktown turned to comb the tracks. She dodged 2 torpedoes. Her gunners shot down Japanese planes left and right. It was a heroic defense, but the Kates were too good. 2 torpedoes slammed into the port side of the Yorktown. The impact was devastating. The Yorktown didn't just shudder, she was lifted. The fuel tanks ruptured. The rudder jammed. All power was lost immediately. The ship took on a list of 23 degrees to port. The ocean rushed into the generator rooms. This time, it looked like the end. The list was so severe that the men on the flight deck had to hold on to the tie-down strips to stop from sliding into the sea. Darkness swallowed the lower decks. Captain Buckmaster looked at his dying ship. He looked at the angle of the deck. He thought she was going to capsize in minutes. He gave the order no captain ever wants to give. Abandon ship. Single quotes. The men of the Yorktown who had repaired her in 48 hours, who had fought at Coral Sea, who had just helped destroy 3 Japanese carriers, began to lower themselves into the oily water. They left their ship listing, broken and alone. The Japanese pilots returned to the Hiryu. They reported, "Second American carrier sunk." Yamaguchi celebrated. He thought he had sunk 2 carriers. In reality, he had attacked the Yorktown twice. The ghost ship had absorbed the entire fury of the Japanese counterattack. By refusing to die, the Yorktown had acted as a shield for her sisters. The Enterprise and Hornet were untouched. They were fully operational. And now they were launching a final strike. They were coming for the Hiryu, June 4th, 1942, late afternoon. While the crew of the Yorktown bobbed in the oil-slicked water, waiting for rescue by the destroyers, the final act of vengeance was being played out to the west. The Enterprise and Hornet, untouched because the Yorktown had absorbed all the punishment, had launched their strike. At 5 p.m., their dive bombers found the Hiryu. The Hiryu was the last survivor of the Kido Butai. Admiral Nimitz was preparing a 3rd strike, hoping to land a knockout blow in the twilight. He never got the chance. The American Dauntless bombers swarmed her. 4 bombs ripped the Hiryu apart. The explosion was so violent, it blew the forward elevator completely out of the ship, throwing it against the bridge. The Hiryu joined her sisters Akagi, Kaga, Soryu as a burning wreck. The Battle of Midway was won. The Japanese fleet had been decapitated. But in the darkening ocean to the east, a ghost was refusing to leave the stage. June 5th, 1942. Dawn. The sun rose over a quiet ocean. The debris fields of the battle were scattered over miles. Captain Buckmaster, now aboard the cruiser USS Astoria, looked out toward the last known position of his ship. He expected to see empty water. He expected the Yorktown to have capsized and sunk during the night. She was still there. The USS Yorktown floated. She was a ruin, listing 23 degrees to port, dead in the water, silent and dark. But she was stubborn. Her watertight compartments, sealed by the damage control teams before they abandoned ship, were holding. The scrap iron of the American fleet, the ship that had been patched together with plywood and prayer, was refusing to die. A buzz of excitement went through the fleet. If she's floating, we can save her. Admiral Nimitz, back in Pearl Harbor, saw the reports. He ordered a salvage mission immediately. Save that ship was the command. But the ocean around Midway was still a war zone. Japanese submarines were prowling, looking for stragglers. To go back to the Yorktown was to paint a target on your back. Captain Buckmaster asked for volunteers. He needed a skeleton crew engineers, electricians, damage control experts to board the listing hulk, put out the fires, and pump out the water. He didn't have to order anyone. 170 men stepped forward. They grabbed flashlights, hammers, and breathing apparatus. They were going back to the Ghost. June 6, 1942. The salvage begins. By the morning of June 6th, the operation was underway. It was a masterpiece of improvisation. The small minesweeper USS Vireo arrived first. She was a tiny tug compared to the massive carrier, but she passed a tow line and began to pull. The Yorktown, heavy with thousands of tons of seawater, moved sluggishly, 2 knots. It was agonizingly slow, but she was moving toward Pearl Harbor. Then, the destroyer USS Hammond came alongside. The Hammond was tied tight to the Yorktown's starboard side. It looked like a child hugging a giant. The destroyer ran hoses and power cables over the rails. They started the pumps. On board the Yorktown, the salvage crew worked in terrifying conditions. They were deep inside a tilted, dark ship that groaned with every wave. They were walking on bulkheads because the floors were angled so steeply. They cut away heavy guns on the port side to reduce the weight. They pumped fuel oil overboard. Slowly, miraculously, the ship began to right herself. 23 degrees list, 0.21 degrees. 19 degrees. She was coming back to life. The fires were out. The towing speed increased. The men on the flight deck began to smile. They were going to make it. They were going to drag the Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor again, fix her up again, and send her back to fight again. It would have been the greatest salvage story of the war. But they were not alone. The eye of the Dragon deep below the surface, invisible to the lookouts. A periscope was cutting through the water. It belonged to the I-168. The I-168 was a Japanese fleet submarine, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe. Tanabe was a hunter. He had been prowling the area for days. He had received a radio message from a scout plane. Drifting aircraft carrier located. He had maneuvered his submarine brilliantly. He had slipped past the screen of American destroyers that were circling the Yorktown. He had moved silently, using the thermal layers of the water to hide from the sonar. Now he raised his periscope. The sight that greeted him was a submariner's dream. The massive Yorktown was moving slowly, in a straight line, and tied right next to her, stationary and helpless, was the destroyer Hammond. 2 targets, overlapping. Tanabe didn't get greedy. He calculated his firing solution with cold precision. He was close less than a mile away. Tube 1, ready? Tube 2, ready? Tube 3, ready? Tube 4, ready. He fired a spread of 4 Type 89 torpedoes. 1:35 p.m. The impact. On the deck of the Yorktown, a lookout screamed, "Torpedoes! Starboard beam!" It was too late. There was no time to maneuver. The Yorktown was under tow. The Hammond was tied to her. They were sitting ducks. The crew on the Hammond saw the white trails racing toward them. The captain of the Hammond ordered the engines full astern, trying to pull away, but the lines held them fast. One sailor on the fantail reportedly grabbed a 20mm machine gun and fired at the water, trying to explode the torpedoes before they hit. The first torpedo, it missed the Yorktown but slammed into the USS Hammond. The destroyer broke in half instantly. The explosion was so violent, it threw men high into the air. The Hammond didn't sink. She vanished. In less than 4 minutes, she was gone, dragging her crew down with her. But the horror wasn't over. As the Hammond went under, her depth charges explosive canisters designed to kill submarines were still armed. When they reached their preset depth, they detonated. A underwater shockwave killed dozens of American sailors who were swimming in the water. It crushed their chests. It was a brutal, heartbreaking massacre in the middle of a rescue operation. The second and third torpedoes. They passed under the dying Hammond and slammed into the Yorktown. The carrier shuddered. The salvage work of the last 24 hours was undone in a second. The patch repairs blew out. The water rushed back in. The list, which had been reduced to 17 degrees, swung back wildly. The salvage party was thrown against the bulkheads. The lights went out again. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound of twisting steel that signaled the end. Captain Buckmaster, thrown to the deck, knew it was over. You can patch a bomb hole. You can fix a boiler. But you cannot survive 2 torpedoes when you are already half sunk. A order was given to abandon ship for the final time. The salvage crew scrambled down the lines into the water, joining the survivors of the Hammond. The destroyers rushed in to pick them up, dropping depth charges to scare off the I-168, which managed to escape, battered but alive. As the sun set on June 6th, the Yorktown was alone again. She was low in the water. She was broken. But incredibly, she was still floating. She spent one last night alone on the Pacific. The ghost ship refused to go down while anyone was watching. June 7th, 1942. The end. At dawn on June 7th, the Yorktown finally gave up the ghost. There was no one on board. No fire, no explosion. Just a quiet surrender to gravity. The list increased to 90 degrees. She rolled onto her port side, revealing her massive red hull and the barnacles on her keel. She looked like a sleeping whale. Then, slowly, gracefully, she slid stern first beneath the waves. She went down in 16,000 feet of water. She took with her the bodies of the men who had died in the boiler rooms, the planes in her hangar, and the secret of how a ship could survive 2 sinkings and still fight the decisive battle of the war. The Yorktown, CV-5, was gone. But she had done her job, because she had sailed from Pearl Harbor when they said it was impossible, because she had launched her planes when they said she was sinking ... because she had absorbed the bombs and torpedoes meant for the Enterprise. The United States had won the Battle of Midway. The Japanese expansion was stopped. The tide of the war had turned. It turned not because of a new weapon or a brilliant strategy, but because of a battered, leaking, patched-up ship that simply didn't know how to die. June 1942. The Pacific. When the USS Yorktown slipped beneath the surface on the morning of June 7th, she did not just leave a void in the ocean. She left a crater in the strategic map of the Second World War. As the bubbles cleared and the oil slick began to disperse under the Pacific sun, the true cost of the Battle of Midway became clear. It was a butcher's bill that shocked the world. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They had lost a heavy cruiser, the Mikuma. They had lost 248 aircraft, and most critically, over 3,000 men, including the elite pilots and aircraft mechanics who could never be replaced. The Kido Butai, the iron fist that had smashed Pearl Harbor, was gone. The United States had lost 1 destroyer, the Hammond, and 1 aircraft carrier, the Yorktown. But the ghost of the Yorktown continued to haunt the Japanese High Command long after she hit the bottom. When the surviving Japanese pilots returned to their bases, their debriefings were filled with confusion. They reported sinking 2, perhaps 3 American carriers. They described a carrier they bombed and left burning. They described a second carrier they torpedoed hours later. They couldn't comprehend that it was the same ship. This confusion paralyzed Japanese strategy. They believed the Americans had a limitless supply of carriers, capable of absorbing punishment that should have been fatal. They didn't know they had been fighting a single, stubborn, patchwork zombie that simply refused to accept the laws of physics. The Yorktown's refusal to die had acted as the ultimate shield. By absorbing the dive bombers of the first wave and the torpedo planes of the second wave, she had bought time. She had drawn the fire away from the Enterprise and the Hornet. If the Yorktown had sunk immediately at Coral Sea, or if the repair crews at Pearl Harbor had taken the standard 3 months to fix her, the Japanese would have concentrated their fire on the other 2 carriers. We might be speaking a different language today. The U.S. Navy understood the power of the symbol they had lost. They were not about to let the name fade into history. In 1942, a new hull was being laid down in the shipyards of Newport News, Virginia. It was an Essex-class carrier, the new generation of warship designed to crush Japan. It was originally going to be named the USS Richard. But when the news of Midway arrived, the order came down from the White House. Rename her. On January 21, 1943, just 7 months after the sinking, the USS Yorktown CV-10 was launched. She was bigger, faster, and deadlier than her predecessor. She sailed into the Pacific with a vengeance. She was nicknamed the Fighting Lady when Japanese intelligence officers heard that the Yorktown was back in the Pacific, sinking their ships and shooting down their planes. It must have felt like a supernatural nightmare. The ghost had returned, reincarnated in steel, but the original Yorktown, the CV-5, lay alone in the dark. The discovery. May 1998. The ocean is a vast museum, but it is a museum with the lights turned off. For 56 years, the Yorktown sat in the crushing blackness, her location known only as a set of vague coordinates on a chart. In May 1998, a team of explorers set out to find her. They were led by Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had discovered the wreck of the Titanic and the German battleship Bismarck. Finding the Yorktown was harder than finding the Titanic. The Titanic sits at 12,500 feet. The Yorktown sits at 16,650 feet, 5,075 meters. That is 3 miles down. At that depth, the pressure is 7,300 pounds per square inch. It is a world of eternal night, freezing cold, and absolute silence. Ballard and his team, partnering with the U.S. Navy, used advanced sonar sleds towed miles behind a ship. For days, they scanned the muddy bottom of the Pacific. It is a tedious process, like mowing a lawn in the dark, looking for a needle. Then, the sonar painted a picture. A massive solid object rising from the flat ooze of the abyss. They sent down a robotic vehicle, the ATV, Advanced Tethered Vehicle. It took hours just to fall to the bottom. As the cameras flickered to life, the team in the control room gathered around the monitors. The lights of the robot cut through the darkness. And there she was. The sight was ghostly. Usually, shipwrecks are piles of rust, collapsed and unrecognizable. But the Yorktown is different. Because she sits so deep, there is very little oxygen. There are no wood-boring worms. There is very little marine life to eat the metal. The Yorktown sits upright on her keel. She looks incredibly intact. She looks as if she could still launch planes. A camera glided over the flight deck. The teak wood planking was gone, dissolved by time, leaving the steel lattice of the deck beams exposed like a skeleton. But the outline was perfect. They flew the camera up to the island, the command tower. It was eerie. The bridge windows were open. The railings where Captain Buckmaster had stood were still there. The signal halyards were still in place. But the most striking detail was the paint. On most shipwrecks, the paint is the first thing to go. But on the Yorktown, the water chemistry at that extreme depth had preserved it. You could still see the camouflage pattern. You could see the dark gray and the light gray. It didn't look like a wreck. It looked like a model sitting in a dark room. As the robot moved along the hull, the scars of the battle were revealed. They found the hole where the aerial torpedoes had struck, the fatal blow delivered by the submarine I-168. The steel was bent inward, torn like wet cardboard. They found the anti-aircraft guns. The 5-inch guns were trained out toward the horizon, frozen in the last position they held when the crew fired at the Japanese torpedo planes in 1942. They were silent sentinels, guarding nothing but the deep. Ballard noted something profound about the wreck. There were no bodies. The sea had claimed them long ago. But the ship felt occupied. It felt alive. Unlike the Titanic, which feels like a tragedy, the Yorktown felt like a warrior resting after a fight. She didn't look defeated. She looked ready. The story of the USS Yorktown is more than just a naval battle. It is a lesson in the difference between the material and the spiritual in warfare. On paper, the Yorktown should not have been at Midway. She was structurally compromised from the Battle of the Coral Sea. She was leaking oil. Her radar was faulty. Her air wing was a patchwork collection of borrowed squadrons. By all logic, she was a liability. The Japanese had superior ships, faster planes, and more experienced pilots. They had the technological edge, but they lacked the one thing the Yorktown had: a crew that refused to accept reality. It was the 1,400 dockyard workers at Pearl Harbor who worked for 48 hours without sleep in a toxic haze of welding fumes to get her floating. It was the damage control parties who ran toward the fire when the bombs hit. It was the engineers who relit the boilers in a room filled with smoke to get the ship moving again. It was Max Leslie and the pilots of the air wing who dove into a wall of anti-aircraft fire with no fighter escort. The German admirals in the Atlantic and the Japanese admirals in the Pacific made the same mistake. They looked at the rivets, the armor thickness, and the horsepower. They treated war as a math problem. They forgot the variable of human stubbornness. When Joseph Goebbels called the Australian destroyers scrap iron, he empowered them. When the Japanese pilots reported the Yorktown sinking, they underestimated the American will to fix what was broken. The Yorktown CV-5 had a short life. She fought for only 6 months. But in those 6 months, she changed the course of human history. She broke the back of the Imperial Navy. She saved Hawaii. She paved the way for the ultimate Allied victory. Today, she rests in the cold, high-pressure silence of the deep Pacific. She is a grave for brave men. But she is also a monument to the idea that you are not dead until you quit. And the ghost ship of Midway never quit.